My name is Stefanie and welcome to Sewing with Stefanie. This is the place where we take sewing and design and make it cool, modern, and fun. Please make sure you follow along on my blog. It's thestylesafari.com, or you can also follow along with what I design, what I make, and everything that I wear on my Instagram at thestylesafari. So let's get started. Today we are learning about how to prepare your mannequin for draping. You obviously need a mannequin. Almost any mannequin will do. There are a lot of expandable ones as well, but just a traditional collapsible shoulder mannequin is best. You're also going to need a few rolls of batting, lightweight batting, really just one roll depending on what size you're working with. And then I cut mine into pieces just to make it a little bit easier to work with. You're also going to need 1/8 thick poly satin ribbon. I pick a dark color so that you can very clearly see it against the mannequin and the batting. You're also going to need a measuring tape, very obvious, but super important. And then last but not least, you want tons of flathead pins. I have probably 100 already pinned into my mannequin so that I can use them easily. I suggest taking them out of the little box they come in and putting them right on your mannequin so you're not wasting time going back and forth, especially when you have to hold things on a mannequin. In order to get started, we are going to have to take measurements for yourself or the person that you are trying to drape for. There are 9 measurements in total. 6 of them are circumference measurements and 3 of them are height measurements. Those measurements are also in the link in the show notes below. So for the 6 measurements that are circumference based, you're going to start above the bust. So again, you're doing this on yourself or on the person that you're draping for, not on the mannequin, but I'm showing you where they are. So above the bust, it's right underneath the armhole and right above the bust. Now, it's very important here that when you are writing down these measurements, you're not actually doing the circumference, you are doing the front and the back. So if you say this whole thing is 30 inches, that's fine, but you need to actually know that it's 15 on the front and 15 in the back. Up bust is the first one, bust line is the second one, so that's gonna go over the widest portion of the bust, followed by under bust. Again, making sure you're doing front and back measurements for all of these. Next circumference is the waist, followed by the high hip. This one can be tricky. High hip, try to think about where your hip jeans, your hip hugging jeans, or where your underwear would lie. That's really your high hip, as opposed to your hip, which is actually the widest portion, and it tends to be right around the back of the seat here. So if you have those 6 measurements, again, it's above bust, bust, below bust, waist, high hip, hip. If you have those 6, that's all you need in order for the circumference measurements, making sure you do front and back for all of them. Then the 3 height measurements you need to get started are really going to separate bust. So that's the apex of the bust, the point where it sticks out the most, to the waist, from the waist to the high hip, and from the high hip to the hip. Okay, now that you know the measurements for the person that you're trying to measure for, we have to compare those to the measurements on our mannequin. So let's start off by just measuring the front of her bust. Just the front part is 18 and a half. Now I'm doing a quick check of my measurements, and my measurements, my front bust, are 17. So that means I am smaller in the bust than my mannequin. Let's double check the back too. Right around that bust line. She's just about 15, and I am 14. So we have a couple extra inches. The mannequin is a little bit bigger chested than I am. I'm not gonna pad anything up here and just use that extra size here for ease. So right away we know we need to add 1 inch to the front and 2 inches to the back. So let's get started. I'm gonna start with a large piece in the back of my batting. I'm gonna layer it right on top and use my flathead pins to pin it, to secure it into the mannequin. Now I know here that I have to add 2 inches. So I'm not gonna measure after each time. Okay, so now that I have her all padded up for circumference, we now need to think about those height measurements. So we have double checked that the bust, the waist, the high hip, and the hip are all padded out. Now we have to think about where exactly is that waistline. So On my measurements, my bust to waist is 6.5 inches. So that means I'm going to put a little mark here at 6.5. Now you want to take your thread or your satin ribbon and mark off that line. Okay, now that my waistline is measured, you want to do the same thing for your hip or high hip. I actually just measure out my high hip and make sure that it feels about right. I don't always add in the poly satin ribbon just because I don't want to add more lines that I don't need. It is an important measurement, but it's not necessarily something that I have to have a distinct line on my mannequin for. So instead, I'm going to mark out the hip line, which I know is 8 inches below the waistline. The next place to place your poly satin ribbon is actually between the two bust apexes. This is just to create an easy line for draping. You don't necessarily always want, unless you're creating a corset, you don't always want something to dip in below the chest. You want it to graze over it. So it can be very helpful to kind of flatten out that bust line right there. I also put a ribbon in for the side. Not everybody does this. It's not imperative because the mannequin does have a ridge where the fabric comes together, but if you're padding up a lot, you may actually lose where that side is based on feeling. So I always like to put it in. It's a best practice so that when you are draping on top, you can really see where that side is. Even if you're not using the side seam, it's a good place to know where to notch. Now you have all of your main measurements for your mannequin. You have her padded up to fit what you need. You have the key points highlighted. And then from here, you're ready to start draping. Thank you again for watching Sewing with Stefanie today. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button below as well as giving it a thumbs up. And be sure to follow me on Instagram at The Style Safari, as well as my blog, thestylesafari.com. Thanks so much.